Hope you can hear me okay. Welcome to Gunnersbury Baptist Church and tonight's great marriage debate. My name is Bruce Dogood and I'm going to be chairing the debate this evening. Before I introduce the speakers, let me give a brief introduction to the venue. Gunnersbury Baptist Church is an independent church whose members have been serving the local community here in Chiswick for nearly 140 years. Not each of the members today, I don't think, but collectively, and living out its mission, which is to follow and make followers of Jesus Christ. It has a congregation of around 150, with Sunday services every morning and evening, together with midweek Bible studies and prayer evenings, and a whole host of other activities in the local community, as not only organising faith-related topical debates, but also help and fellowship with the elderly on Wednesdays, a Mums and Tots group on Friday, a Dads and Tots group on Saturdays, a daytime drop-in centre that meets in the foyer out there every morning, a series of children and youth groups, and it also plays its part supporting the state. It is acting as a polling station this Thursday in the local elections, and of course, it is a venue registered for the conduct of weddings, complete with its marriage register and leaded ink pen. Now, to our speakers who will be debating tonight's motion on marriage, the motion is, should marriage be redefined to include same-sex couples? And on my right, your left, Adrian Trett is going to be proposing in the affirmative on this. He has a background in financial services and also local government. He is currently a full-time Liberal Democrat politician, with most of his time occupied as chair of the Lib Dem LGBT group, which is lesbian, gay, bisexual and transgender group. His star has been steadily rising in recent times. He reached the national stage as the author of the successful equal marriage motion at the 2010 Lib Dem conference, at which he spoke for the motion at conference. And if the Lib Dem voice is a source that can be trusted, this success is inspiring Adrian to higher things. I quote from that source, "It has given me the incentive to go further than I thought I ever could, getting into a position to stand for office in 5 or 10 years' time." So we may be seeing more of Adrian in the future, and we will be hearing from him this evening. To my left is the Revd David Robertson, who will be speaking against the motion. He is the minister at St Peter's Free Church in Dundee. He is the author of the Dawkins Letters, one of the main Christian responses to Richard Dawkins' book, The God Delusion. He's the director of the Solas Centre for Public Christianity in Dundee and a frequent debater on the radio, the broadsheets and the blogosphere. And in recognition of this topic, he's been doing a bit of David Cameron-style pitch rolling on the topic, preparing us for the sensitivity of the issue. He has agreed with Peter Hitchens that those who argue for traditional marriage are regarded as equivalent to those advocating the clubbing of baby seals. But he goes on to say, the fact is that much of the media put forward an emotive and irrational position, and the Christian position is rarely heard. Well, one assumes we will hear it in only a few moments. My role is primarily to ensure that we stick to schedule, and that you as the audience get to ask some questions in an orderly way. So this is what the plan is. We're going to have up to 20 minutes for each speaker to put forward their argument as they speak on their own without interruptions from each other or the floor. There will then be up to 10 minutes for each to reply to the points made. We're then going to have a moment's break while we change the tape at the back, because this is being sound recorded. I guess it will be a download on the web in due course. And then we'll have questions from the floor, about sort of 15, 20, 25 minutes. I think it will depend how active and energetic everybody is. I'll say a bit more about the questions, but it is about questions, not speeches. And I will come back to that later. And then each speaker will wind up. We go back into reverse order, I think. So that means David will give his final thoughts, and then back to Adrian. We aim to finish at about 9 to 9:15. One or two quick housekeeping points. Mobile phones, if you could have them switched off, they interfere with the microphones. That would be great. I guess if you're some distance away, it might be okay, but if the microphone's coming near you, have that switched off. Fire escapes. There are fire escapes through the curtains on each side, left and right. There's one at the back on my left, and you can go out through the main doors as you came in. Final thing, there are teas and coffees and refreshments at the end. So, let's welcome our two speakers in the traditional fashion. So I think that means, Adrian, we hand over to you. You're going to speak on proposing this motion.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. I'd firstly like to say I hope we look forward to a good, reasoned and fair debate on this topic. I know it's quite a controversial one. So whether the government is proposing a redefinition of marriage or not is the question that we're asking. In my opening words, I would like you all to keep one line in your mind as I speak, and that is evolution and equality harness in today's world the human right for equal marriage. I'll return to that sentence at the end of my speech. Now, I'm going to be very honest here. I'm not a person of faith. I am, in truth, an atheist. So I'm not going to spend the next sort of 20 or so minutes ridiculing religious organisations or intolerant right-wing members of parliament for their short-sightedness and opposition to equal marriage. That's not what I'm here to do. This debate here is for me to try and bring reasoned thought to the table, enlighten those who are against marriage equality with constructive, decent and well thought through arguments why this redefinition of marriage is consistent with the times we live in and society that ultimately demands those evolutionary changes. I'm here to put forward the reasons why equal marriage categorically is a human right. No ifs or buts. It's open to everyone and should not be prevented by any one of those groups who hang on to past definitions of society, not realising that even marriage has evolved and changed, and today is now the right time, and some might say about time, for marriage equality. Fundamentally, no one group or organisation, for example the Church, that somehow believes and pretends to represent a majority of the United Kingdom's population, which in fact it does not, and exists in order to have the right to divert the course of the United Kingdom government away from bringing forward further steps to marriage equality. Polls in the United Kingdom have shown that 60 to 65% of the population are in favour, whilst the number of people attending church unfortunately decreases year on year. So the relative percentage of people who understand these matters is not there. Furthermore, in the United Nations Charter for Human Rights, it states that marriage should be open to all men and all women as a human right. Curiously, I'm mindful to point out that it doesn't say marriage is open to all heterosexual men or heterosexual women. It says all men and all women. That means everyone. So I ask myself, why is this not the case around the world? Unfortunately, human rights, which yes are the same rights entitled to everyone, whether they're lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans or not, aren't respected around the world. And though much work is continuing to be done, however, the issue of same-sex marriage, even here, we currently are behind the curve and therefore need to get our own house in order, and certainly before we start lecturing any other nations around the world on this specific issue. Even if you give in to arguments which, personally, I don't believe, that is purported by the religious groups that Christianity and its beliefs have been there for 2,000 years, as apparently marriage has been too without any change, and yet further, when you examine the numerous examples of same-sex unions in historical records dating throughout the centuries, you do wonder sometimes what planet we live on, and why are people so blinded by prejudice. Now, for more details on the same-sex unions, this I would suggest you all read. It's called The Marriage of Likeness, Same-Sex Unions in Pre-Modern Europe by John Boswell. It's a fascinating and in-depth historical read, but I will give you a few small snippets from the book. One of the most clear and uncontroversial stories is the association of St. Sergius and St. Bacchus, which is highlighted and celebrated as them being sweet companions and lovers. That is the most compelling evidence written in the New Testament Greek describing them as lovers. Their orientation and relationship was not only acknowledged, but it was fully accepted and celebrated by the early Christian church. Records of Christian same-sex unions have been discovered in such diverse locations, such as those in the Vatican, St. Petersburg, Paris, Istanbul, Sinai, to name but a few, covering thousands of years from the 8th to the 18th century. The evidence convincingly shows that what the modern church claims has always been its unchanging attitude towards homosexuality is in fact nothing of the sort, and proves that for the last 2 millennia, in parish churches, cathedrals, throughout Christendom, from Ireland to Istanbul, and even in the heart of Rome itself, gay and lesbian relationships were accepted as valid expressions of a given love, commitment to another person, and a love that could be celebrated, honoured, and blessed. However, I don't just want to concentrate on history, because I believe we must move forward. But I hope that gives you a little insight into the way society did once think and live, and that furthermore, society evolves, and possibly evolved retrospectively during very recent centuries, forgetting past understandings into something that actually previously it wasn't, and whereby the single most important argument that is used by the church is utterly flawed. Once one reads a well-acknowledged expert and scholar on this issue, it brings a lot more into perspective. And therefore, society may have evolved in a way, in a direction that was different to what it was seeking to do, and we are perhaps trying to go back to understanding some of those ways that once were. Some might say that injustices exist and they are in time overcome. I will further add to the concept of time of matters of great importance. Perhaps they're forgotten, because they have happened and accepted without any question. For example, if everything always stayed the same since the year dot, then, for example, women wouldn't have the right to vote, as was achieved by Emmeline Pankhurst and the suffragettes in the early 20th century. Black people would still be segregated in buses in the deep south of the United States, and you wouldn't have had the first American black president in 2008. And finally, even more starkly, therefore looking for biblical precedents, which is a very erroneous tool to use, because there are lots of things God apparently never approved of in the first place. One such thing was polygamy. However, this is readily accepted in the Bible if you see the King Solomon stories. Or for that matter, the Levirate duty of a man to marry his brother's wife if his brother died, or payment of dowries. So therefore the point here is that those who argue that marriage has remained unchanged since biblical times, and that we should not therefore change, have not thought through their argument, and in some cases with stunning hypocrisy. So the lesson learned for me is simple. Times have changed, and we as a society change, with the only well-known view of the general public, not from those who are determined to keep the status quo as it is now. On to some further thoughts. In 2005, a civil partnership legislation came into force as a separate but not quite equal policy. Unlike the political rhetoric expressed by the government of the day, civil partnerships are not entirely equal to marriage. One must realise this, and for those that desire full marriage equality, with all its symbolic and technical detail, it is for that reason that I started to campaign on this. I'm very proud of it, from 2010. Even though, and I'm saying this personally, that for others like myself, I may not even desire a civil partnership, or for that matter, marriage. But amongst the LGBT community, we must not let personal views of relationships and splits and disagreements within our own community give ammunition to those who don't want equality. Because some people may legitimately feel that civil partnerships are sufficient for them. Others might not like the hierarchy that marriage entails. However, we must as a community unite behind a vision that marriage is right for all, disregarding of one's preference, And as chair of the Lesbian, Gay, Bi and Trans Liberal Democrats, I believe very firmly that in my role, I must represent the whole of the LGBT plus family and not just worrying about my own personal desires, but the happiness is vastly outweighed by the general community view that marriage is what an overwhelmingly significant percentage of our community desire and therefore the human right to possess. You're bound to ask me next the question, well, give us an example where civil partnerships are not equal to marriage. So, already prepared, here goes. These are fictional in name terms, but based on real-life cases, and I'll add my thanks to the Lesbian and Gay Lawyers Association for their very simple but clear YouTube video, which you can all view online, and which illustrates the point far better than I can by speaking it. However, this is an example. Paul graduated in the mid-1970s and became a teacher. From the beginning of his career, he joined the Teachers' Pension Scheme. He met Gavin in 1985, and they have been together ever since. In 2005, Paul and Gavin registered a civil partnership. Paul plans to retire from teaching in 2013, at the age of 60. He will then receive his teacher's pension. If Paul dies before Gavin will get a dependent's pension based on 25 years of service from 1988 to 2013. This is about 15% of Paul's final salary. If, however, Paul had married Geraldine and was going to die before her in exactly the same scenario, she would get about 22% of his final salary as a pension for 35 years from 1978 until his retirement. And therefore the pension is almost 50% more each month than the pension Paul will receive. Paul paid exactly the same contributions into his pension scheme as all his male colleagues. But because he's gay and he's in a civil partnership, the man, if he survives Gavin, gets a smaller pension than the widows of his colleagues. I ask you, is that fair? A second example is Bernice and Patricia. They retired and they're going to move to Portugal, where they have bought a house to live in their retirement. Portugal recognises same-sex marriage, so same-sex couples can get married in Portugal. However, Portugal does not recognise a UK civil partnership. So if one of them dies before the other, then potentially in Portugal there would be a death duties to pay on the house. This is simply because the civil partnership is not recognised as a marriage in Portugal. Bernice or Geraldine may have to sell the house and end up homeless. If Bernice and Geraldine could get married in England, then it would be recognised. These are just two very practical examples regarding pensions and inheritance, which could be resolved if the UK granted equal civil marriage, if the UK government granted equal civil marriage in the United Kingdom. Furthermore, marriage equality would fundamentally redress a very disturbing situation currently present in UK law, whereby trans people would no longer have to suffer the horrendous process of divorcing one's loved one in order to gain legal recognition of their gender. For trans people, the Gender Recognition Act of 2004 was a half measure and meant annulation of one's marriages and civil partnerships would occur to achieve their human rights, however, with very profound consequences. For example, a woman who would be seen as such were she naked in a gym changing room will be treated by the law as a man, including being locked up with male prisoners if she was to be given a custodial sentence by a court. A situation which just cannot be acceptable in today's world. Couples in marriages where one partner had undergone gender transition were treated particularly unfairly by these previous half-finished laws. Some of the strongest marriages around were, in cruel irony, subject to state-coerced divorce, with gender recognition being used as both the carrot and the stick for those who refused to end what had become in effect a same-sex marriage. These situations would be rectified with marriage equality. However, further amendments would still be required to ensure that those marriages which were confiscated by the state are reinstated, as that currently is not part of the proposed legislation. So therefore, getting to a point where, referring back to the title of the debate here today, and many points mentioned above will resonate with this. It is the government redefining the term marriage? Well, firstly, I asked myself, if this redefinition is such a gigantic issue, why are there in 10 or so countries around the world where same-sex marriage already exists, and I can't recall any of them, Spain, Portugal, Sweden, Netherlands, Belgium, Norway, Iceland, South Africa, and others, have had any massive debate about the government redefining some basic parameters. In the 1949 Marriage Act, one of the first clauses states that a marriage is between a man and a woman. Now, this would clearly have to be changed to a marriage is between two people of any gender. That way, this very small change in wording would make a massive progressive step to signify marriage equality for all the citizens of the United Kingdom. The argument that is proposed by some is that civil partnerships are already equal to marriage, as I've already said. This is key, the answer is not. And even if legislative changes were made to previous acts to correct some of the changes and not to reform the Marriage Act in total, in my view, those differences, whether they be in terms of tenancies, inheritance, pension rights, international recognition, being considered next of kin for certain legal purposes, or adoption, and so on, all of those reasons are much harder to oppose because they allow lesbian, and gay, bisexual and trans people to have the same rights that everybody else enjoys and to enjoy their life in the way that everybody else does.
5 minutes.
Thanks. Therefore, I come to our present-day situation. The coalition government launched its consultation on March the 16th, 2012, and it will last until June the 14th. It is imperative that every LGBT, lesbian, gay, bi or trans person, and non-lesbian, gay, bi, trans person that views marriage equality as a human and basic right responds to the consultation, so the government receives the largest support for its legislative changes, and to push forward the process to achieve the goal of equal civil marriage. However, there are two further issues which I would bring to your attention. As I'm sure some of you who read party political policy know that the Liberal Democrats are the only major party with the official policy of equal marriage. Only major party, I have to say. Whereby some elements of the policy, which I was the author of in 2010, are not actually currently intended to be included in the proposed legislation of the coalition government. Specifically, these two issues, which are firstly allowing those religious institutions, like the Quakers, Unitarians, Liberal and Reformed Jews, as examples of religious groups who would like to perform same-sex marriages in their churches. One might consider that they should have an opt-in to those denominations that would like these functions, similar to the Ali Amendment on Civil Partnerships Bill, which may be away in the future. And those who believe in religious freedom, as I do, and I believe everyone else does too, and the right for LGBT people of faith, and whose churches would like this facility, should be encouraged in the consultation to respond to that question answering, I disagree with the proposed legislation, explaining why this should be permitted, as it currently isn't. Secondly, belief in marriage equality fundamentally believes that marriage and civil partnership should be open to everyone, and for the British people to consider their choice of how they celebrate their relationship. Therefore, belief in marriage equality means that civil partnerships should also be open to opposite-sex couples, those particularly who don't feel that marriage suits their own personal preference. Every couple should have the right to choose. So, I point you to both those questions in the consultation, numbers 5 and number 8, so that people should respond to them to ensure that marriage equality covers all bases, as I believe this is the opportunity for this to be achieved. So, I move to my final point. As in my opening statement, I asked you to remember those words. Evolution and equality harnesses the human right for equal marriage. And we in Britain should be ready to spread that statement of belief. Marriage has evolved over centuries, and we are living at a time where equality has been changing and moving in the right direction too. And this is just another step whereby recognition of same-sex couples and making it possible for every couple of whatever gender to choose and to celebrate their relationship in the way that best suits them. This means that marriage, and yes, even if one considers this as a redefinition of marriage, is the right way forward for the United Kingdom in the 21st century. Thank you very much.
Thank you. David, it is yours to reply.
Okay. Well, again, I think I'm glad to be here. I was a little bit reluctant in this, and let me explain why. I want to make two pleas. The one is I want to make a plea for tolerance. I think I have to admit that there are people on my side, particularly who we would say from a Christian perspective, who at times behave in a way which to me is not indicative of a proper Christian attitude to tolerance. I also object strongly to the demonization of those of us who hold to the traditional view of marriage as automatically being homophobic bigots. In the past few years in discussing this, I have experienced a level of abuse, intolerance and suppression that is actually quite astonishing. And I object strongly to the fact that it's very difficult to even get to discuss these issues. It's kind of a shibboleth issue, which results in considerable bullying and intolerance for anyone who dares to question the prevailing ethic of what I would call the elites in our culture. Even this week, I was discussing the issue on those most dreaded of things, an internet blog site or something. Don't do it, really, it's not worth it. And in the course of that discussion, I was accused of being a homophobe, a liar, evil, and someone even wrote I preferred David Robertson when he was in a coma. I hadn't been too well recently. Why? Just because I was arguing for what 20 years ago in this country everyone would have assumed was normal. And even when the Civil Partnerships Act was passed, we were assured this was it. That was it. It wasn't going any further. I didn't believe it then. I don't believe it now. Our chairman mentioned Peter Hitchens' quote. I was quite amused by it. That's why I quoted it. The full quote is, "I used to take parts in debates about homosexuality. I used to try setting out a careful, principled position on it. Then I began to notice something. It was a subject on which it was pointless to be reasonable. You might as well have tried to offer a reasoned defense of clubbing baby seals." I find myself in our schools that our children have been continually taught, how can you be against gay marriage? That's against equality and progress and the evolution of it. And you're automatically shut out as being some kind of bigot. So I'm very grateful that Adrian has come here and is willing to discuss this. Tolerance does not mean that you agree. I think some of our political leaders and some of our media people need to realize it's okay to disagree. It's what happens in a mature society. You don't all have to agree. It means you're willing to tolerate the opinions and values of those you do not agree with. So for those of us who are Christians, I would say, please remember the Bible teaches we are all sinners in need of God's forgiveness, and we don't have any right to sit in judgment upon anyone else. I think my second plea is one for reason. From a Christian perspective, we sometimes ally ourselves with people who have the kind of yuck factor. Oh, I don't like that. I don't like those sort of people. Well, that should have no place in any Christian perspective on this discussion. Equally, on the other side, the arguments used are often emotive and based upon personal experience. I'm not a great fan of our current Prime Minister. I don't think you'd accuse me of coming from the Christian right. I regard him as being the most incredibly wonderful person at using lots of words to say nothing. And I find the vacuity of his arguments about gay marriage as being quite astounding that anyone could take it seriously. In fact, I do worry about the future of our country being governed by people who seem to speak entirely in emotional terms rather than any degree of logic or reason. So I appeal also for reason. Now, my case is simple. I stress again my concern is with marriage, not with homosexuality. And I want to lay a series of objections which I would argue are not religious objections. I accept that there are many people, I basically accept Adrian's premise, the majority of people do not go to church. I don't think the church has a right to dictate to the culture what should happen, but I do think we have a right to argue for what is best for the whole of the culture. We could do what our secularists want us to do and retreat into our churches as kind of the equivalent of Trekkies or knitting clubs and just have our own views. But I think that's not, we care about the whole of society, and I think we want to argue for a Christian perspective. But I'm going to argue it, and please don't be disappointed with me if you're a Christian, I'm going to argue it from what I would consider to be not particularly religious reasons. First, and it's a minor point, this consultation is not a consultation at all. In fact, it's a ridiculous thing to use the word. The government has already told us what they're going to do. They're not consulting to find out what our views are. They're trying to generate support. When the end result is predetermined, it's not much of a consultation. Lynn Featherstone says that marriage belongs to the people, not to the churches. I agree. So let me challenge Lynn Featherstone right now in the government. Let the people decide. Let's have a referendum on a subject that is of far more importance even than us belonging to Europe or having a referendum about having mayors of London or Birmingham or elsewhere. Secondly, and this is the major point, same-sex marriage cannot be granted without changing the meaning of marriage, which is why David Cameron stated that he would redefine marriage. The point about it is this: it's not that you have something that is here and then you say to homosexual people, okay, well, you get to have this. It's that what you do is you change this completely. It's not marriage anymore. In fact, the government has no more right to do that, or the logic of doing it, than for them to say that they are going to pronounce all squares are circles, or that the earth is flat. The meaning of marriage is straightforward. It is the union between one man and one woman for the threefold purpose of mutual companionship, the procreation and upbringing of children in a secure environment, and the good of society. Now, if one accepts that traditional definition of marriage, then by definition, there can be no such thing as gay marriage, hence why it needs to be redefined. Precisely because the procreation of children cannot be achieved by two people of the same sex. The secular state may wish to claim all sorts of powers, but the ability to enable two people of the same sex to have children without the intrusion of a third or fourth party is beyond even the power of the state. When the British government claims it has the right to redefine marriage, it is in fact doing nothing of the sort. It is just simply undermining the traditional Christian understanding of marriage to the extent that we believe, or I believe anyway, it negates it completely. Once a government abrogates to itself the right to redefine marriage, then there is of course no logical reason why any government should stop at same-sex marriages. I was intrigued by Adrian's comment, definition of marriage, marriages between a man and a woman, to marriages between two people of any gender. Well, can I marry my son then, if that's going to be the legal definition? That's the logical position. What do we mean? Well, two people who love one another, you immediately start adding lots of different qualifications. And why restrict it to two people? What if I feel that biologically I want to have, 6 wives? If I could find 6 women daft enough to marry me, then yeah, why not? What's the difference if the arrangement is between consenting adults who love one another, as Lynn Featherstone did? What is the difference? If marriage is not about procreation and with the availability of modern birth control methods, then why should polygamy and incestuous marriage not be allowed as well? Now, the inevitable hysterical cry of that comes that we're equating gay marriage as being synonymous with polygamy and incest. I am not. I'm just simply pointing out that the criteria being used in the current debate would, if accepted, be logically and equally applicable in these cases. I'm intrigued when politicians use words like love without defining it. There's a case just now, for example, in New York, where their father is suing the state in order to allow him to marry his adult consenting daughter. It's interesting, the debate I was referring to, which took place on the website, I asked this question and I received private replies from 5 people who were all arguing for gay marriage, who said, in principle, we see nothing against having marriage between siblings. Now, I'm astonished that people can't see that that's exactly logically where we will be going. And by the way, I don't buy into Adrian's view of history, and it's a common view of history in our culture that basically we're all a bunch of backward peasants, and then gradually we've evolved until we've reached the absolute apex of humanity, basically West London. If you're from Kensington or Richmond or Gunnersbury, you're at the peak of human evolution, and we're just going one step further. That's not the way that it is. That's not the way that human history works. I actually read a considerable amount of early church history, and the early church fathers, the Nicene and the anti-Nicene fathers. There are enough volumes there to sink a ship. And I read them, I actually do read them every day. And none of this debate is new. For example, I read last week in the Recognitions of Clement from the 3rd century. Again, there is a custom among the Persians to marry mothers and sisters and daughters. In all that district, the Persians contract incestuous marriages. He also stated this: in the regions of Britain, several men have one wife. This is the 3rd century. In Parthia, many women have one husband, and each part of the world adheres to its own custom. Charles Moore, writing in The Spectator, said this: the government does not like extending tax exemptions to new groups, but it is much more frightened of the gay lobby than of unmarried sisters, so it appeases the former. A friend of mine speculates that if gay marriage comes in, it would be a good idea for him to marry his son. He would do so not because he has any incestuous desires towards the young man, but because of the need for inheritance tax planning. He rightly points out there can be no logical reason, if homosexual marriage is permitted, why fathers and sons should not marry one another. After all, there is no chance of their giving birth to deformed children. The third reason I would say is this: I accept that most people's support of this is based upon a general feeling of goodwill, but it's not rationally thought through. The reality is that same-sex marriage will offer no more than civil partnerships. So why is there the pressure for same-sex marriage? For some, it is a symbol of acceptance of homosexuality as a normal part of society, and I understand that. But for others, there are a small minority of people who have a deeper agenda. They describe what they are doing as queer theory. Now that's their term, not mine. Whose main aim is to destroy what they consider to be the restrictive morality of the Bible and Western tradition, of which marriage is one of the 3 key legs. Dostoevsky, always an astute observer of society, had one of his characters sum up the agenda of the self-styled radicals. Make haste and lock up the churches, abolish God, do away with marriage, destroy the right of inheritance, take up your knives, from his marvelous novel, The Possessed, or The Devils. In different forms, several societies of right and left in the 20th century attempted to enact this radical agenda with disastrous consequences for humanity. I find it ironic that almost all politicians and political parties in Britain are rushing lemming-like into something which, in effect, in my view, negates marriage. For all these reasons, I think we're walking blindfold into a minefield. The United Nations, almost every nation in history, and our own British nation has defined and accepted marriage as being between one man and one woman. We have no idea of what will happen once that definition is removed and redefined. I also believe this: I don't trust politicians, and when they tell us, don't worry, it won't affect you in the church, I couldn't care 2 hoots. I expect the church to be persecuted. But I do not believe for a single minute that once this passes, that one day I will be sued for refusing to marry a gay couple. That is inevitable. The European Court recently decided that there was no right to gay marriage. However, it also pointed out in its judgment that if nation-states allowed gay marriage, then to refuse it would be discriminatory. And I fully expect to be prosecuted for that. And I'm sorry, but verbal reassurances from governments, from politicians, mean absolutely zilch to me. I applaud the Prime Minister's desire to make Britain a better nation and a fairer society. I don't, however, think that instigating gay marriage and thus undermining even further the Christian foundations of this society will lead to a better or fairer nation. Indeed, in my view, although perhaps with the best intentions in the world, it will lead to further social disintegration, sexual confusion, and greater intolerance, where any in public life or service who dare to uphold the Christian view of marriage will be ostracized and discriminated against. If the British Parliament takes the step of redefining marriage, and the Scottish Parliament is desperately trying to be quicker in doing it, because of course this is the sign of a truly liberal and progressive society, then rather than displaying boldness, fairness and wisdom, I believe it will demonstrate cowardice, injustice, and folly. Interesting, on the tube today, picked up a metro and said this is about civil rights. Indeed. It is about the civil rights of people in this country, and I actually think it is the majority, but it wouldn't matter for me whether it was a majority or not to have my marriage redefined by an arbitrary parliament who can then redefine it again in 5 years' time. The state does not have that right, and that would be my major objection. I did say, and I think my time is just about going, so let me finish.
Just 5 minutes now.
Just 5 minutes. See, perfect timing. I've said it, I think, here before. I'm a postmodern Presbyterian minister. The word finally means nothing to me. But here's where I'm really coming at with all of this. I believe every single word that I've just said. But I'll tell you one of the things that disturbs me, and Adrian's comment about progression and evolution and so on, the evolution of society, we're all marching towards this wonderful nirvana. As a historian, I find that just breathtaking. But the other thing that I think kind of disturbs me in this, and the obsession with sex in our society, and generally it's not the churches. You know, I honestly believe that David Cameron is only using this issue to try and prove he's liberal, to try and prove that he's nice, while meanwhile in implementing an economic program which is absolutely devastating. And I just think it's just an issue that he thinks is actually not that important, but it's just a demonstration, a symbol of something. For me, my concern is that there are far too many of us who take our identity from our sexuality. Normally, if someone comes up to me and says, "Hi, I'm homosexual," I go, "Hi, I'm heterosexual." Now, what's your point? Well, what is the point? Where do we get our identity from? I think it is very dangerous to be teaching our children that their identity is founded primarily in their sexuality, especially when you're in your teens and you're very confused about lots of different things to do with sexuality. I think we're far too quick to push sexuality as an ideology. I think that our wholeness comes from many other things, including our sexuality. I'm not saying sexuality is unimportant, but I think there are many other things that are involved, including family life, including our physical health, including our mental health, well-being, our identity, who we are as people. And my take as a Christian in all of this would not be to argue, you must do what the church says, because sometimes the church is nuts. I wouldn't argue that you must do what the church says. But I would say this. You ever go to IKEA? Or maybe you'll live here and you'll get your furniture all ready-made for you. But you go to IKEA and you get the package back home. It's pretty important for me, obey the maker's instructions. And I think that that's where we are at as Christians. I think God intended us to have whole, full, wonderful lives. And I think the only way that we have that ultimately is through Jesus Christ. And I think for me, I would say, for society, let's obey the Maker's instructions, not embark on some kind of dangerous experiment which we do not know what the end result will be. I have nothing personally, I do not want to attack people. I don't want to put sexuality at a level, where you're homosexual, I don't want anything to do with you. That for me is ludicrous. But I think in terms of humanity, where we find our identity, is hugely important. And I think this whole marriage debate is actually quite disturbing, the prominence that it places upon sexuality. And I've already indicated I just believe it's completely illogical as well. But thank you for your patience.
Thank you. Great. Well, each speaker very good on timing, 18 and a half minutes each. You have a chance now to reply to some of the points raised by David and put forward any further parts of the argument, about 5 to 10 minutes.
Okay.
Thank you.
I'd firstly like to thank David for his very open and fair and reasoned attitude, because actually that's something that's key in this debate. It's not a debate about shouting at each other, it's a debate about listening to each other. And even though as I stated earlier, I'm not religious, I come from a religious family. However, I knew when I was a lot younger that I was gay, and the church was not somewhere that I was welcome. Now, that may come as a surprise to some of you, but actually this is the first time I've ever done this in a church. And it does make me wonder, perhaps I might have been a congregation one day, previously, if I had been welcomed when I was a lot younger, because of my sexuality. Now, the argument that David has said is you aren't identified by your sexuality. Well, I'm afraid the answer is you are. Because you wouldn't have someone outside the door proposing a booklet for you all to read about the evils of homosexuality if there wasn't an issue of identity. Now, I'm very happily gay, and I've been through most things, so to be frankly honest, nothing can really be bothered to worry me. However, I think if there was a young person who was 14 or 15 and they were given that booklet to read, I think they would be, it would be difficult for them. And I think it's unfair that that sort of level of debate needs to be brought to these sort of occasions, because we're actually here to debate marriage, not homosexuality. So I just want to make that point, and I hope everyone realises that. As to David's various points, I'd say on the consultation, now obviously being a Liberal Democrat and being within the coalition government, the consultation is there because it is there not if this will happen, but how it will happen. Now, that's a very difficult, coherent point to make. The fundamentals of it is that actually all main three political parties in this country, Conservatives, Labour and Liberal Democrats, actually all agree that actually this is a right step. So actually, whether you have people within Parliament who are against it or not, the vast majority of them probably are. So the consultation is setting out questions for people to respond to when it comes to very difficult issues, and one of those happens to be the religious aspect of it. Now, I understand, and I'm non-religious, but I perfectly reasonably feel that some denominations do not want to celebrate same-sex marriages in their churches. And I have no problem with that. That is the church's determination to do what they feel is right. And I have no wish to impose it upon the church, and neither does the government have a wish to impose it upon the church. That's very clear. This consultation is about equal civil marriage, not religious marriage. And I would like to stress that point very clearly. So the consultation is a method of gaining people's views and understandings. Now, it may be that there are lots of responses that say, well, actually, the Quakers and the Liberal Jews and the Unitarians really do want same-sex marriage in their churches, and there will become an opt-in, which is what happened in the Civil Partnerships Bill, which happened in December 2011, whereby ceremonies can take place on religious premises where those denominations would like to. And that's what I think is the fairest and the best way of doing it. It's a matter of, again, a matter of choice for those couples and for those churches. As to the complication of the definition of marriage, which I'm obviously going to contradict David slightly here. Because yes, in traditional terms, a man and a woman, they are able to procreate and have children and have families. That doesn't mean to say that two men and two women can't have families. As we already know, there are several couples around the UK who have children who are two dads and two mums. It's already happened. So it's not something that's going to be suddenly stopped or not allowed. So if that already exists, why stop two men and two women having the love and the commitment they have to each other, which is just the same as a man and a woman? And I have a partner, we don't have a civil partnership and we are not married. But, if we wanted to have a family, then I wouldn't say no to that, because that prevents a lot of people who might like to be dads. And I think you have to be I'm being very open and clear with you that, yes, the traditional view is there, But as I've said to you, times change, definitions change, and we are in a different century now to what we were 2,000 years ago. And therefore people have to make that understanding that those families already exist. Why prevent those two people, those couple, from celebrating it? And that would be my response to David on that particular issue. As to my final point, going down the sort of extremist route that says, oh, if you're going to allow same-sex marriage, then you go down the polygamy and incest. I'm sorry, it doesn't wash with me. And it's as simple as that. I don't agree that will happen, because I don't think society knows its own boundaries. There are already polyamorous relationships in the UK. They exist all over the place. So there shouldn't be any reason why those shouldn't happen. So to give the idea that polygamy is something that has never occurred before and that gay marriage is going to increase it substantially is not the case. Surprisingly, polygamy was actually in the Bible. King Solomon had, I don't know this off the top, 60, 70 wives.
600.
600 then. Well, it's even too many then. But it was allowed then, so what's the problem with it now? This is where I find a slight hypocrisy of the Bible to then ridiculing what's happening today. And as someone who's not a religious theologian, I don't quite understand why saying one thing in the Bible earlier means something different now. So that would be my point on that. But I don't believe that this is going to... Society isn't going to suddenly end up into a complete despair because of these different relationships. I don't think that is going to happen. And I think people have to understand that. But that's what I'll say for now.
Thank you very much. David, a few questions thrown back at you.
Okay. Just to go through those, plus also some of the things that Adrian said, that I bit my lip when I went through my own thing, not adding on to them, but just maybe addressing some of them now. The UN, the polls, 60 to 70% in favour. Yeah, right. You know that 83% of statistics are just made up. You know how polls work, don't you? That you're a particular agency. Don't trust a poll from anybody. With this government, this country is meant to be a democracy. We're not meant to be run by opinion polls commissioned by specialist groups and the way that they're done. I wouldn't trust a poll from the church. You know, the Catholic Church has a poll which shows that there's 60 to 70% of people who are for traditional marriage. It depends how you frame the question and so on. Polls are to me utterly meaningless. The United Nations, that's very, very relevant, because there is no doubt at all that the United Nations Charter refers to marriage between one man and one woman. And when Adrian says all men and all women, that shouldn't just be all heterosexual men or all heterosexual women, okay. Well, that shouldn't just be, or if it's going to include homosexual, why not say all polygamous men or polygamous women? Why not say incestuous men or incestuous women entitled to marriage? What if someone says, well, I want to marry a 12-year-old, why shouldn't I be entitled to do that? And so on. You will find that argument just doesn't work. And I love the argument of same-sex unions in pre-modern Europe. We live in a postmodern society. That means we're ahistorical. It means basically we know nothing about history, and we have a Wikipedia pick-and-mix attitude towards history. You will always get some expert who is going to find something in the past that will confirm your current view now. So there will be a book somewhere that tells you that in the 3rd century they believed that Martians had invaded Earth, and so on. You will always find whatever you want. And as I say, I read, and I really mean this, I read this regularly. The early church fathers, all that's involved, even the apocryphal gospels, the stuff that even Dan Brown couldn't make up. I read this stuff, and you know this, there is nowhere, anywhere, any evidence of same-sex marriage. There are some indications, and they're extremely rare. There are some indications of very close relationships. They may even have been homosexual. You know, when we get argued this case, a lot of people will say, well, in ancient Greece they didn't know what homosexuality was, and now we do. And so, yeah, the Greeks didn't know what homosexuality was. Have you read your Greek myths? Of course they knew. The irony is, our society is not progressing. Our society is reverting to a pagan Greco-Roman society that existed almost 2,000 years ago. That's where we're going to go. It's not evolution into progress. It's true, everything does not always stay the same. Sometimes we go backward. And for me, this would be a retrograde step. Solomon, I do have the advantage of you over Adrian here in terms of being a theologian. Little bit of advice in terms of interpreting the Bible. There are things that are prescriptive and things that are descriptive. Do not murder is prescriptive. Solomon having 600 wives is not Solomon had 600 wives and hey, wasn't that a good thing? It was Solomon had 600 wives, and the Bible actually specifically says, and these wives led his heart away from the Lord. It was actually condemning Solomon having 600 wives. And he had them not because he was particularly lecherous, though if he wrote the Song of Solomon, that's a very interesting Kama Sutra of the Christian faith, as some people would see it. But he had them because he was making political alliances. That's how you did it in those days. You wanted to ally with someone, you married their daughter. So he basically married as many as possible. It was not accepted. Certainly, polygamy was to some degree in that culture at that time, and Jesus gave us the answer. It's the same reason he gave for the very lax views on divorce in the Old Testament. He said it's because your hearts were hard. God didn't intend this way from the beginning. You speak, and I understood what you were saying about the LGBT plus family, and there are different views. There most certainly are. I've read numerous articles and had individuals speak to me who said, well, we're not for gay marriage. They're opposed to it. They do accept my argument that would undermine marriage. I've been asked, are you opposed to civil partnerships? And my view is that civil partnerships exist in our culture, in our society. The examples that you gave can be dealt with by civil partnerships. The example of Paul, for example, change the law on civil partnership to allow equal inheritance and pension rights. Don't destroy the traditional view of marriage. And the example from Portugal, well, if Portugal insists on having not civil partnerships but gay marriage, and the couple who are gay are living in Portugal, get married in Portugal. It's the European Union, you're entitled to do that. You don't need to change the law. Why are there 10 countries? That's 10 out of 183 in the United Nations. And to say there was no marriage debate in the Netherlands or Spain is a little bit disingenuous, at least according to my Dutch and Spanish friends. I don't accept, equality changing and moving in the right direction. My fear is actually we're moving away to a more unequal society. I think it's rather bizarre that we have a society that is becoming economically more unequal. The poor are becoming poorer, the rich are becoming richer, and yet the definition of equality is whether we allow gay marriage or not. I find that quite extraordinary, and I'm saying that as somebody who couldn't belong to the Liberals because they're too right-wing for me. I'm really, really quite puzzled by that. And you say greater equality. Try telling that to the Catholic adoption agencies who were refused the right to children who desperately need adoption just because they don't accept the whole idea of same-sex marriage, or they wouldn't go for gay adoption. Now, there was no liberty there, and I don't believe there'll be any liberty in the future. I would want. Well, I'll leave this last point I'll leave my last point to the last, which is kind of logical. Consulting. Isn't it extraordinary that we are expected to believe that the government is consulting us as to how they are to implement something? You're the government, you're supposed to know how to do it. What are you consulting us for? You should be consulting us as to whether we want it or not. But of course they're not going to do that because they are the elite. They are the Etonians who know exactly what we should want if we're going to progress. Well, no, consult us about what we want. Don't consult us about how to do it. Or we could start consulting about how we should pay politicians and so on. I had one politician say this to me, and this is the unequalness of society. He said, David, this is my view. And he told me, he said, I basically agree with you, but you can never quote me or use my name because it's more than my career is worth. I'm afraid that's where we're at. Most of our politicians are spineless. I don't know what they really think. Some are not. Some are very actively pro-gay marriage. They really believe it. I don't call them spineless, and some are against. I don't call them spineless. But the vast majority to me are spineless, and they say, well, if we're going to have any kind of trouble, we're just backing out of this because it's not that important to them, at least not as important as their career. Adrian says, I have no problem. I don't think this is going to happen, etc., etc. I'm sorry, you cannot ask us to believe in wishful thinking that yes, you have no problem now, but in 5 years' time or in 10 years' time, when the police come knocking at my door saying, excuse me, but did you refuse this couple because they're same-sex? You realize that's homophobic. I actually think there's a logic in that, by the way, because in our culture, do we say, well, we allow marriage interracially, but if someone wishes to refuse that on religious grounds, that's fine. No, it's not fine. It's not fine. Religion doesn't trump everything. So to me, that whole argument is just saying, trust us. We don't want it just now. Everyone's going to be nice. But no, 5 years down the road, that is not going to be the case. And my last point would simply be this. And I would say this to Adrian. You would be very welcome in my church. I would welcome any gay person into my church. I will uphold the Bible's teaching on sexuality and so on. Actually, in the Christian church, we have a far greater problem with sexual immorality amongst heterosexuals, don't we? Adultery and sexual promiscuity and so on. So, when someone, to me, everyone is welcome in the church. What they're not welcome to do, of course, is come in and say, I'm coming into your church and you've got to change your beliefs to suit me. That's not going to happen. But you are welcome, and I'm not going to pick on you or say, well, because then I'd be a hypocrite. I would, because then what I'd be doing is I'd be putting sexuality way up on this pedestal when I've just said it's not on that pedestal. So for me, Adrian, you would be very, very welcome, and I really, really look forward both to your conversion and to your standing up at the Liberal Democrat conference and telling us why you've changed your mind and why you're going to be arguing against gay marriage. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much to both of you for your responding to each other. We're just now going to change the tape, which is recording this this debate. And so you have 1 minute to turn to the person next to you and ask them what question is on their minds that they want to put. And maybe you can encourage each other to take the microphone in just a couple of moments' time. Okay, we're just about ready to restart. I'll just say there's Lawrence at the back has got a microphone, and he's going to be roving around, taking my direction. So please wait for the microphone to arrive. It means that everyone can hear the question, and it also means that the sound recording gets the question. If you could just kind of indicate to me in the normal way that you want to speak, and then that means I can kind of clock you. Thank you. There's a couple of people doing that. That's brilliant. What we'll do is take questions. You can provide a bit of context, the background to your question, but really keep it tight. 10, 20 seconds is the kind of thing. And then ask the question, make it a debate between the debaters here, and that means we get around lots of questions. If I find there's a lot, we'll batch things. We might take 2 or 3 at a time and then enable them to be answered collectively. So, this gentleman in the middle put his hand up first. Let's have the microphone over there. Thank you.
Thanks. You made Adrian, if I can ask you a question. You made an interesting point about human rights. You said that people have a human right to get married, whether it's to a person of the opposite sex or a person of the same sex. I noticed that in your talk you didn't actually discuss children at all. And I'd like to raise a question about children. The UN Charter on the Rights of a Child says that a child has a right to be brought up by its parents. Do you accept that a child has a right to be brought up by its mother and father? And does that trump your right for equal marriage?
Thank you very much. Adrian, I think that's for you, but I'll give the other speaker always a chance to comment. But do go ahead.
Okay. Very good question to say. On the argument that a family can already exist with 2 men and 2 women anyway, and they can still have a mother and father, maybe a surrogate mother, which may not be in the same context that you're considering with a traditional view, but it can still happen. And I don't think personally that though the right of the child is to have a mother and father figure, which you're always going to have, even in same-sex relationships, where you generally have a male or female donor, whichever one you are missing within the relationship, I don't think that trumps the human right, because I think everybody has that human right to do whatever relationship they want to have. And, if that then involves having children as well, I don't think that's an issue, whether it's a male and female, or two male or two female. And I think because you still have that role model of both, because all the relationships within lesbian, gay relationships do have a male sperm donor or a female egg donor as well. So what are you missing there?
David, do you want to?
Yeah, actually, because Adrian just reminded me there's something you'd said previously as well. What a fascinating phrase, missing within the relationship. That was my whole point. It's not that you don't have a family. You could have two males who are bringing up children and so on. But the point about it is you can't have that without the intervention of a third party. You can't. And that is very, very, very important, because we know genetically as well how we are made up. You need to know. It's very, very important. And I think the notion of manufacturing human beings to enable people to have children, I'm very disturbed at the kind of Orwellian, not Orwellian, Aldous Huxley really, Brave New World type approach. I'm uncertain, I have to say, about, I don't know enough in terms of the information, and Adrian will probably know better than me, of children being brought up in gay partnerships. But it's certainly not possible to have a family in that kind of partnership without the intervention of a third party. And that was what was intended, one of my major points.
Lawrence, question just there, actually. Thank you.
I've got two questions, actually, Bruce, but I'll try and make them as quick as possible. The first is about the difference between equal rights and equal names, which I think is really the heart of this debate. Very much in favour of equal rights and in favour of civil partnerships. I'm wondering why we all need to be called the same thing. And I would ask particularly Adrian, no doubt you refer to your female colleagues as lesbians. Why don't you refer to them as gay women? If we're going to have equal names, shouldn't it be gay men and gay women? If it's all about equal rights, we have that, and it's working extremely well in civil partnerships. If there are some anomalies that you've pointed out, they can be changed. The second question I'd ask both speakers is where this is leading us to. Because equality, it seems to me, has to work both ways. And I'm glad that Adrian has pointed out that, in fact, this bill is going to lead to less equal rights in terms of heterosexuals. And there will be a large body of heterosexual people who would want the right to have a civil partnership that is not marriage. And it seems to me inevitable that if homosexuals have both choices, there will be a huge body of pressure for heterosexual civil partnerships, which is clearly going to undermine marriage and could well have a three-step process of living together, civil partnership, and will people end up getting married. So I think there's a real danger of undermining marriage there. Equally, on the other hand, as has been pointed out, there's a real danger, it seems to me, that there will no longer be any church marriages, because the equality legislation is going to force churches, as it did with the Catholic adoption agencies, to choose either between having gay marriages in their churches or having no marriages in the churches. And I think we are looking at a real possibility with this legislation that's currently drafted of having a very significant effect on the ability to get married.
Thank you very much. And perhaps, Adrian, you might take that first, but could you clarify, if there is a same-sex marriage, does the civil partnership fall away? Or no. might it be retained, or is that a consultation question?
That is one of the consultation questions as well. In my view is the retention of civil partnerships should still happen, and marriage will be alongside it. I don't see any reason why we should annul people's civil partnerships who've already had them.
Or just convert them into...
Some people may want to convert them into marriages, which is perfectly reasonable within the legislation. But there's no current thinking that civil partnerships will be got rid of and be replaced by marriage. That's certainly not the case. As to the couple of points mentioned, yes, gay women, gay men, fine, haven't got a problem with it. Lesbian is a term that, depending on where you come on the equalities front, I'm mindful of my colleagues who prefer the term lesbian to gay women. That's just how it is. So that's the reason why I usually use that term, especially within the LGBT framework, which is how we describe all those different sections together. As to the anomalies that I mentioned earlier in the Civil Partnership, they can't just be changed by changing the Civil Partnership Act. That's one of the main issues. So, though it's a good point, and I fully see where you're coming from on it, actually those anomalies are all revolved around our pension laws, which goes back to 1978, and I'm not experienced enough to know exactly everything that has to be changed, but I know it can't just be done by changing the Civil Partnership Bill. The other issue with regard to the opposite sex civil partnerships, absolutely. I mean, Liberal Democrat policy is very clear. They should be open to all. It doesn't happen to be coalition policy because of another party within the coalition. And you can make up your mind what I mean by that. So if people do want opposite-sex civil partnerships, like the Equal Love campaign, which some of you may have heard of from Peter Tatchell, where he particularly mentions that, I agree. I think it will be one of those other options that people have, but I've always said that it's a matter of choice. And why choose for one group that can't choose for the other group? So if both groups have marriage and both have civil partnership, then everyone is equal. And I don't have a problem with that question. And there was one other point that I think you made at the end, which is I'm struggling to remember now.
It was about the effect of churches having to choose.
Yes, choose.
And don't you feel really that it's a fallacy under the Equalities Act to suggest that this is about civil marriage? Very soon there's going to be pressure on churches under the Equalities Act. If people are allowed to marry, they should be allowed to marry in a church.
Well, I actually don't think that. And this is where I suppose my plea to you does go, that civil partnerships, for instance, in the recent bill that went through the House of Lords at the end of November last year, there was a big debate about having religious civil partnerships. And the whole issue was it was for the church to opt into it. And there was a series of different documents produced by different groupings from the Christian churches and whatever, saying, "Oh, we're going to be sued if we don't agree to doing civil partnerships in our buildings." And the fact is, it's not the case, and I don't think it will be pushed the case either. I happen to agree that Catholic adoption agencies should, if they are not willing to take on gay couples. I think that's wrong, personally, because they're doing a business. It's the same thing with hotels and not allowing couples to go to a hotel example in Cornwall or wherever, where they're running a business and they are welcoming everyone to their place. Therefore, you can't discriminate against whether there is a gay couple or a straight couple. It's very simple. And I'm afraid they have been found guilty of the law, and currently that's still going through, and that's the case. So that would be my view on that.
Thank you.
Can I?
Yeah, David, do you want to come in on that?
Yeah, just, I'm sorry, but adoption is not a business. Yeah. I don't want to get sidetracked any more than church is a business. We welcome everyone here. And I'm sorry, I participated 15 years ago in discussing gay adoption, and I received numerous assurances at the time that those who were opposed to gay adoption would not find themselves discriminated against, either in terms of their business or if they themselves wanted to go for adoption. And unfortunately, that is what happened. And in my view, the track record will remain exactly the same. I also seriously, I mean, I'm glad I came here because I've learned something. I had no idea that this idea of civil partnerships and marriages going on together. You see the confusion we're getting into? That means I could have a civil partnership with somebody and be married to somebody else. What would be wrong with that? And the other thing that I struggle with, And maybe this is where my thinking is now going, and I'm pleased, this is a personal opinion, not my church's or the Christian faith. I'm beginning to wonder if, as a church, if the churches, we shouldn't just back out of the state marriage business altogether and do what they do in Holland, which is the state registers people, and then the churches can choose to have their own marriage ceremonies. Yeah. And therefore, we are not compelled to do something. When I do a wedding, I'm acting as an official of the state. Therefore, it is inevitable that when gay marriage is taken on board, I will be sued for refusing. That is inevitable. So for me, one of the ways around that is, if this is going to go ahead, it would be just to say, allow partnerships, legal partnerships to be developed in the way that they do in the Netherlands, and then let churches have their own marriage ceremonies and so on. And by the way, why should we discriminate against two sisters who want to have a partnership and inherit their inheritance rights and pension rights and so on, who've been living together for 50 years? Why not? I mean, to me, this whole thing is so messed up. It's not as simple as people put. And the kind of responses we've been getting, it does make me fear for the future. If we're going to go this route, then we've got to have something that's a lot better than is being proposed.
Okay, there's lots of hands going up. This gentleman over here, actually, this guy next. Then it can go back to the back. This lady, and then this one.
I just wanted to compliment the nice spirit on the panel. I just think it's really nice, because it is a difficult subject. Mm-hmm. You wanted some context. I've been listening to a lot of stories of people who have been abused within the church circles from heterosexual ministers and stuff. I don't want to go down that line, but I'm very passionate about truth, wherever it's coming from. My first question I was going to ask you, Kevin. Is it Kevin? Sorry. Adrian, sorry. Forgive me. Must have been a spiritual word or something. Did you ever at one point wish you weren't gay? That's the first question to you. And secondly, I'm appalled by the way the church, or traditional church, the Etonian thing, which I totally get where you're coming from, has shown very little compassion towards the Christ-like compassion, which we're all looking for from leadership, towards those of other persuasions. And I think that's the bit where I think a lot of gay people are perhaps upset and feel marginalised. And I just wanted to hear what your feelings were about that.
Adrian, never wished you weren't gay?
No is the answer. Very simple. I knew at a very young age. I'm not going to pretend that I didn't know. And though I believe it's genetic, I know that there are within my family generations before me who happen to be gay men, but they never, with these odd uncles somewhere that never ran away. And it happens to be my generation that I've been honest and open enough with the people and my family and who I work with and my colleagues and my friends that I am. And I'm very happy to be so.
David, about the church, could it be more Christ-like?
Well, the church can always be more Christ-like. Have you ever been to an anti-hate rally? It's full of hatred. Of course the church can be more Christ-like. But there's not a but with that. I actually think, when you talk about being marginalised, I think I'm marginalised as a Christian. And I've got over the angry stage of it now. I'm not angry. I don't live in a Christian country. I think this is a marvellous opportunity to proclaim the gospel of Jesus Christ, and I'll happily do that. And I'm quite happy to say, genuinely, I believe that God loves every single individual, but he loves every single individual enough to challenge their lifestyles as well. And I'm not going to compromise on that. But I think, yes, we have to show. I wish I was more compassionate. I can be a bit aggressive at times, but I kind of love you aggressively, if that's okay.
That gentleman at the back.
David, just want to point out, in the church, so if a man and a woman are both convicted paedophiles and they want to get married, the church will marry them. If a man and a woman are convicted prostitutes and drug addicts, the church will happily marry them. the church is against adultery, but it doesn't try and ban it. I just wonder, don't you find the whole thing that if just two people love God and love each other, they should be allowed to just get married?
Yeah. Unfortunately, I don't agree with the premise of your question. So for me, the question doesn't make sense. Because actually, if a couple were convicted paedophiles and they came to me and asked about getting married, I'd be extremely cautious about whether that should happen or not. Not least because I think part of getting married is... well, no, not necessarily. Not, I'm sorry. No, actually, whether they're married in the church building, you see, what you're doing, sir, is you're taking a certain set of presuppositions and automatically assuming that's what I think. It's the law of the church. No, the church will marry two convicted paedophiles. The church will marry two drug addicts or two prostitutes. The church will marry two people who want to get their kid into the local school. With all due respect. But you just said yourself, you'd be happy to be...
Can we allow the question? Can we allow the answer?
Can I answer the question?
Let's answer the question.
Yeah, because I couldn't care two hoots about the law of the church. You see, that's what I'm saying. Your presupposition, you're putting upon me a position. You're asking me. It's like asking me, when did you stop beating your wife? You're asking me a question which to me doesn't make sense because I wouldn't automatically say, okay, yes. Or if you want to get your... I mean, what a ridiculous thing that some people get married because they want to get their kids into a school or whatever. I regard that all as completely absurd. So, yes, of course it happens, but don't ask me to defend a position. That's not what we're talking about, the whole institution of marriage and whether that should be redefined from being between a man and a woman to be between people of the same gender. When I say that it's between a man and a woman, I don't mean that anyone who comes to me and says, well, I want to get married, well, because there's a man, you're a woman, you can get married. What if it's somebody who's regularly beaten up his previous wife or something? No way. A paedophile, I'd be, why are pedophiles? And by the way, in terms of the logic of the government's point of view, I'm questioning where they go with all of that. I mean, you bring paedophilia into it, it becomes very, very dangerous. There are 1 million people in Britain who are registered sex offenders. Now, that's absolutely astonishing. I'm very concerned about where that's happening. But I just think the basic premise of your question and the notion that, I mean, the more important part of it, the bit I can identify with, you say, with two people who love one another. What does that mean? That's my problem. Two people who love one another. If that is your criteria, it's what I said before. If that professor in Columbia University says, I love my daughter, I wish to marry her, that's the criteria, two people who love one another. There's got to be more to it than that. I just don't buy into this Mills and Boon image of marriage. It's two people who love one another. Why get married at all? I've more sympathy with Adrian's position saying, well, why do I need to get married for?
Again, you're against adultery, but you don't try and ban it.
Not only am I against adultery, but I certainly do try and ban it. What do you mean by ban it is... Well, it has. And can I put it in this way? The whole point about the Bible, and when you say the church, you see, it's so varied what you mean by that. I prefer to go by the Bible. The Bible is absolutely clearly against adultery. Totally clearly against adultery. And if someone came to me who was someone who regularly committed adultery, if you like, and wanted to get married, I'd say, no, forget it. I'm sorry, but there's no question that the Bible is against adultery. And that's why, by the way, where I have a little bit of sympathy with what you're trying to say, but not much, but I have a wee bit of sympathy, is I find it abhorrent when Christians go, oh no, that person is homosexual, we can't have them, but then they turn a blind eye to people who have been adulterous. Well, which is worse? I think that's absolutely ludicrous. Biblically, I think it's ludicrous. Yeah, but I'm not responsible for the law.
We'll leave that one. Adrian, do you want to add anything to that, or shall we move on? Okay. Can I just see how many questions there are in the room? Okay. Well, look, I'll tell you what we're going to do, because we're running a bit out of time. Can we just hear the questions? Can the speakers take some notes on this, because you can deal with them all in your kind of winding up.
Okay.
So we'll get round everybody on this basis, but it'll be... short questions, if that's possible, please.
I just had a question for David. I'm not sure I understood one of your arguments before in your first speech. When you talk about you're obviously quite concerned about redefining marriage and that it can lead to all these other sorts of things. That's what you're concerned about. And I think the example you gave was that, you know, if marriage becomes just between two people of any gender, what's to stop someone from marrying their son? Obviously, at the moment, the definition of marriage is between two people of opposite genders, but our law does not allow a father to marry his daughter. So I'm not really sure how you can use that as an argument, because that's still between two opposite genders, a father and a daughter, but that isn't allowed in our law. So there is a way to redefine marriage, but still keeping these things that we don't want in place. And I just, yeah.
Thank you. We can go round in kind of geographical order, so let's have the microphone over there. Thank you.
It's just a short question to David concerning what the young man just said. When you are conducting a marriage, do you counsel the couple before you marry them? That's a question. You can answer that.
Yes.
Do you counsel them?
Yes.
And decide whether or not personally you will marry this person or not?
Yes.
Do you have the right to say yes or no?
Yes.
And to Adrian, I see you as part of the government, because you mentioned the Liberal Democrats. Mm-hmm. With the burden of the society on your shoulder, and the fact that you are an atheist, what is your hope for the society with the fact that you don't believe that there's a God and there is anything else beyond what we are living in to hope for?
Thank you. I think it's going to the middle here.
It's a question to both gentlemen. If there are no kids involved in marriage, necessarily, or at least that's not a presupposition, as you're suggesting with gay marriage, what's in it for the state? Why should the taxpayer give tax breaks to gay couples, and for that matter, civil unions? The state invests heavily in marriage. It's of deep financial cost to the state. The state shouldn't give any free handouts to people. The state traditionally invests in marriage because it's investing in the future upright citizenry of the state, which are engendered by the heterosexual family. But if there's going to be no kids involved at all, you will say with adoption there is, but that itself is questionable. Why should the state give tax breaks to two people who love each other? If I love my tennis partner, should I still suddenly get tax breaks?
Okay,
You know, if I love my mum, should I suddenly get tax breaks?
Why tax breaks?
Why tax breaks,
Okay,
and what's in it
thank
for
you
the
very
state?
much. Let's go to the man in the front. Yep, thank you.
I didn't get your name.
David.
You talked about a lot reason and logic, and something that has been clicking in my mind is 50 years ago, we were 2 billion people in the planet. Today we're 7 billion. We're going to be, if we carry on like that, 21 billion in 50 years again. So when you defined marriage, you kind of highlighted the need of having children, but in actual fact, I think we are having a social and big problem to the planet, because, you know, we need to rethink our basis, because, you know, where are we going with all of this? You know, the planet is one. Before 500 years ago, we had the Americas to discover, but then, you know, okay. Where do we go from?
Is the question where are we going? Okay,
Yes.
Thank you. Lawrence, let's see if we can... gentleman might be closest. To the back. Just here.
Oh, thank you.
Adrian, you made a point of pointing out some very important words that you said at the beginning and the end of your speech. Evolution was a very big, important word for you. Mm-hmm. But there are two things I'm not clear on that I would like to have clarified. I'm not very clear on exactly what you mean when you use the word evolution in this context and how it fits into the logic of your argument. Because evolution is a pretty broad word. And especially when you apply it in a sociological context, it could describe different things. It could be describing that over time stuff just changes, or it could sometimes mean inherently that stuff changes for the better, getting better and better and better over time. So I'm just not quite clear on, so when you used the word evolution, specifically, what do you mean by it, and how does it actually fit into a specific logical argument supporting gay marriage? It would be good to get a bit more on that.
Fine.
Thanks very much. My name is Dr. Chris Vichel. I'm a local resident. I wondered, what is your view on the fact that while I've engaged in debates on this and related issues, I found your side almost never refers to scientific statistics on these matters. It's almost like they're being brushed under the carpet. 68% of gay men who claim to be in a relationship have had 2 or more other partners on the side, sexual partners, within the last year. That is not the normal definition of a partnership.
We're going for quick questions
yeah,
now,
yes,
so
of course,
if you can turn it into a question.
That's my basic point. And the first country to take gay marriage, I think, may have been Norway, but by now, 20 years later, 80% are born out of wedlock. That shows callous disregard, surely, for the children and for the faithful husbands and for the faithful wives within that. And when we see your liberalising and secularising, the effect of it that it has had on that we never find anything where there's not a multiple hundreds of percent increase in harmful things. Abortion, divorce, pornography, the list simply goes on. Cohabitation with all its negative effects.
So I think we get the picture.
Yes,
so
but it's always a multiple 100% in the wrong direction. That is evolution, it is change, but it is change for the worse. Yeah. Not all change is for the better, and you know it. Everybody here knows that.
Thank you. What's happening right now is more and more hands are going up. I think people are liking the microphone now more and more. So we're just going to add 2 more. The gentleman at the back's been waving at me for a while, and so has this gentleman, and then we'll have to guillotine. Thank you.
I have a bit of a problem with the consultation document when it refers to something called a religious marriage, as if this is some new category of marriage. So in a sense, it destroys the idea of redefining marriage, because now we have 2 marriages. And I suppose the people of faith would say, well, couldn't we call ours marriage and you call yours non-religious marriage? Or indeed, couldn't we call it something else altogether and still keep marriage? So I'm having difficulty, but I'm having more difficulty with the actual definition of religious marriage, because many religions, as far as I know, may not agree with marriage. So you can't call it a religious marriage. You'll have to find some other term for it. But couldn't we, my question simply is, couldn't we just leave marriage as what it is and call whatever else you want something different?
Interesting. So this gentleman, and then I think we'll go to our speakers. While the microphone is travelling, I'm going to have chair's right to ask one question of my own, which is who actually does have kind of control or ownership of marriage? Is it the state or is it the church? That's the question I have. Maybe that's for David, maybe for both of you. And my other question is, Adrian, in particular, is there any natural limit to marriage? I mean, could it be between 3 people, or could it be with I don't know, with a horse, for example? Are there any limits to how you could define marriage? We'll go to this gentleman.
So 2 very quick points to the 2 gentlemen. Wouldn't it be better to answer the gentleman's question at the very back about adultery? Christians don't want to ban adultery, nor do we want to ban homosexuality. There is no ban on same-sex marriage. Marriage is between a man and a woman, between 2 men, between 2 women. Under current law, it is void ab initio. It doesn't exist. It is a non-entity. Marriage is between man and woman. It is society's prescription for the relational ideal for the sake of the family. That's the key point here. There's not just a word we're talking about. There's a fundamental social institution for the good of society. But the final thing is just, I think we've been a bit softball with Adrian on freedom of religion, if I may say so. In America, where they've introduced same-sex marriage, there have been times when... Sorry?
Some certain states.
In America, where they've introduced same-sex marriage, in states where they've done so, they've actually withdrawn funds from churches when they refused to have same-sex marriage. There was one particular Methodist camp or retreat centre which was heavily fined in New Jersey because it would not perform same-sex marriages. Now, the question is not to you whether or not you think religious freedom will be denied here. It is, can you guarantee to us that it will not be denied? And I think the answer to that question is very clearly, no, you can't.
Thank you very much. Okay, so We're now going to just wind up. In fact, I think we followed a normal convention. So as Adrian went first, he goes last. So David, if you could reply, you've got, I think we'd better say 7 minutes.
Yes, I was going.
There's a lot to back in. So.
Yes, I was going to say, are we winding up in terms of, are we answering these questions and then having a short wind up, or are we?
I'm afraid it's the whole wind up and up, including
questions. All right, okay. Yeah, right. Okay. Well, I'll have to rebel. No, Mr. Chairman, I'll try and go with it.
You can.
I can do it. Yes, I can do it. Okay. The gentleman over there. Thank you so much for your point about counselling people. Yes, I absolutely reserve to myself the right to refuse people if I think their marriage is unbiblical or wrong, and I will continue to do that, whatever the state says, yes or no. It doesn't, and counselling is hugely important in that. The lady there, the point about redefining marriage, that was well put, and I think correct, except for this. I still haven't heard any government minister give us a definition of marriage that it's going to be redefined to. When I hear Lynn Featherstone saying it's between two adults who love one another, I would say, look, sorry, that's primary school stuff. I want a legal redefinition of what marriage is. I haven't heard the government say this. They're consulting us about something that they haven't given us any definition of. Now, if they're saying, well, we're going to redefine marriage, so in effect, it can only be between heterosexual and homosexual people, and it can't be between siblings, it can't be between close relatives, it can't be polyamorous and all the rest of it. That's fine, but please don't patronize us by saying it's obvious, it's two people who love one another. That's not obvious. The taxpayers, what's in it for the state? I can't remember who asked that, but thank you. With all due respect, I think you're about 10 years out of date, because the Lib Dems, of all people, and Cameron is just bowing to them, are absolutely refusing to give breaks for marriage. I married a couple who within 6 months split up because they could actually get a lot more money out of the state by splitting up. And that's why they did it. They carried on living together. They just annulled their marriage. They just lived apart, got divorced, because the state absolutely refuses to recognize marriage. And I do wish that the Lib Dems, instead of pushing all this stuff about gay marriage, would actually encourage the government to support marriage a lot more. And I think it's actually a very, very tax-efficient way of doing it. It costs an absolute fortune to have children in care. It costs an absolute fortune to have people in prison. And marriage is by far the most stable arrangement for society. The 7 billion, the 21 billion, reason and logic and so on, having too many children, that's a very straightforward argument, but like most straightforward and simple arguments, I think it's a little bit more complicated than that. There are some countries, such as Italy, such as France, who have found that their populations are rapidly declining, and they're having to import lots of people. I think the number one reason that people have massive families in what we call two-thirds world countries is because of poverty. Because half your children are going to die, and they're going to be the ones who look after you when you get older. So we need to deal with issues of poverty, which is far more important, rather than seeking to impose. And this is what will happen, by the way, in a new form of Western liberal imperialism. We're going to link aid to whether people accept a Western liberal definition of sexuality and marriage. And I think that's absolutely outrageous and atrocious. 50% of people born out of wedlock and so on. To the gentleman who said that, I'd say, whatever you do, you cannot blame that on the gay community. Well, and what do you mean by liberal? Because I actually like the term liberal in this way, because to me it means open-hearted and generous. But I don't necessarily define that to all members of the Liberal Party. But I'm sure if Adrian is... But the far bigger issue facing us as a society and as a culture is the whole question of broken down society and so on. Now, to me, again, it's a typical Cameronian thing that he has identified that and then has not really gone along with Ian Duncan Smith and others who've tried to seek a way to help sort that out and encourage it. Religious marriage, great point about religious marriage. Don't like the term religious anyway. What does religious marriage mean? Old style Mormon, 7 wives, a Muslim, should have 4 wives? We're going to make exemptions on those grounds? I honestly actually don't think we should. If the British state decides to give up on Christianity, which is going to be difficult because there are those within the church who quite like the civic Christianity that exists, but if the British state is to go that way, then so be it. But just don't compel the rest of us to do that. Who has ownership of marriage? Our chairman asked. Church or state? The answer is neither. I think that marriage is an institution that ultimately comes from God. I believe that it was given to us at the very, very beginning of humanity, and I think we don't have a right to redefine what God has given. It comes back again to obey the Maker's instructions. I am absolutely not prepared to say the state has the right to redefine marriage, and actually I don't think the church does either. And then marriage with a horse. That's our chairman's mind has interesting ways of going. I knew a man who lived down, I grew up on a farm in the north of Scotland, and a man lived down from us in an old army fort, and he officially, his name was Tex, he said, and he married his horse. And he said he had a pact with his horse that, as a teenage boy, this was fascinating. He had a pact with his horse that whoever died first would eat the other. There is a Japanese gentleman who has sued the Japanese government to be allowed to marry his avatar, because that's the only thing that he has any real relationship with, real in inverted commas. I just think, look, it's not rocket science. Marriage is between a man and a woman. That's been traditionally given. I would say it's given for very, very good reasons. The whole argument about civil partnerships, and I think we're going down a route. The government says we're going to redefine marriage, and they haven't even told us how they're going to do it or what that redefinition is. Maybe I could summarize. I think that's probably, is that my 7 minutes gone?
You've got about 30 seconds.
Okay. One of the questions was summarized by the chairman about what is your hope. My hope is not that we defeat the government on this. My hope is not to fight for some kind of Christendom, or my hope is not even to say, oh, the poor wee church, we're getting hammered, and, those nasty liberals, conservatives, Labourites, whatever, there's no socialists left. My hope is not in that. And my hope is not defined by my sexuality either. My hope, honestly, isn't even defined by my family. There's an advert I saw on the television, which was quite extraordinary. An alarm company, what do you value? I love my laptop. I love this. I love that. I just have to simply say, my hope is built on nothing less than Jesus' blood and righteousness. Now that's religious jargon. So let me explain it to those of you who think, well, what is he talking about? In fact, I can't explain it to you. Ask me afterwards. But basically, my hope is in Jesus Christ, the ultimate human being, the Son of God, and it's for him that I live, and I believe that every one of us, gay or straight, anyone, we need to know who Jesus is. So that is my hope, and I'll leave you with that good old-fashioned revivalist, but genuine plea.
Okay, well, there's quite a few points to run through, so I'll try and do them as quickly as I can. As to the young lady's point, I think it's a very good point, because that's why I believe that opening marriage to same-sex couples won't lead to incest between fathers and sons and mothers and daughters, because it doesn't happen now, and I don't think that will push it to do that either. So, very good point. As to the older man over there, what is my hope for society? That's a tricky question. As a Liberal Democrat, some of you will know that one of our key planks was to get the lowest paid out of paying income tax, which is something that's happening under this government, which wouldn't be happening if it was a Conservative government. So I do believe that the Liberal Democrats are trying to help those who are poor and needy and need help, a lot more than our media or possibly other people represent. So that would be my hope, that we continue in that vein to help the people who are least well off in society and to give them those advantages of not having to pay income tax and hopefully they can then live their lives better than they would without it. So that would be my point on that. Going on to evolution. My point on that was not, as you might have gathered, was just about evolving. It was about evolution in general, not a specific thing, and not about whether we're going from 2 BC to 4 AD to 10 whatever. It was very much a point about how society changes. Now, in 1975, I wasn't born, so therefore, at that point, homosexuality was still illegal. Or 1973, or whatever the date was. Or 67 then. Okay, way before I was born. So therefore, the argument that says that things don't change and society changes and people's views change for the better, as far as I'm concerned. Very much so.
So you think every possible change is the best? Leave the speaker to finish, please.
I think what I'm trying to say to you is that society has... If it was such a bad change, I wouldn't be here. Lots of other people wouldn't be here. But the fact of the matter is there are about 6 million lesbian and gay, bisexual and trans people in the United Kingdom, which, tells you that there's not just a few people, it happens to be, there are lots of people, and therefore I find that remark quite insulting, I have to say. As to about relationships and about whether 61% of gay men have other partners, well, I'm sorry to say, but lots of straight men and women have other partners too.
Yes, but more.
I don't think there's any point in that. You're worrying about statistics, as David said earlier. Statistics can be made out to whatever you want to find them to be. So therefore, I don't think that whether you use opinion polls or statistics, whatever you want to say, people are going to read them in whatever fashion they like. Religious marriage. It's a good point. The consultation has been called equals civil marriage. Whether there is another word that possibly better describes religious marriage, I'm open to ears. If people have better ideas than that, or feel that there's a different way of describing that, please tell me. I can go back to people and give those ideas back for you. The other issue about the state, I'm sorry to say I'm going to disagree with David because I think it is the state that decides how our society runs. Now, I don't believe it is the church's place to decide because I just don't think that. I do believe it is the state that decides, and if the state wants to make a change, then it has the right to do so. Now, I actually don't have a problem with the situation in France and Holland, where they have a civil union and you register at a registry office or whatever, and then you go off and do whatever religious ceremony you like to have. I haven't got a problem with that, and if that's what we end up doing, personally, I would be quite happy with that, because that means that people can all register, whoever they are, and then you go on to the ceremony you can have in your church, wherever you want to be. Now, I think that's a pretty good compromise, actually, to try and put forward everyone's desires and wants, but that would be my view on that. I think that is all my notes on here. I don't think I've missed anything else apart from the horse. I have to say that's just pushing it a bit too far. I don't think is where it's going to go to. And as I said to the young lady down here, I don't think incest will then become going everywhere either. I just don't think society will allow that to happen, and that that will be that is what I would say some right-wing extremists might come out with as a point of like bestiality or whatever, but it's not going to happen. So summing up, and I'd just like to pay tribute to David, actually, whilst we're both on the platform here together. It's been a very fair, reasoned, intellectual and understanding debate, which is what I wanted it to be, and not a debate which you normally see, possibly at Prime Minister's Question Times, where it's just shouting match, which is not what we all want, and we all want to learn things and understand. So I can say thank you to you all for respecting me as well. I much appreciate that, and coming here. And I hope to say that I do believe that this will go through Parliament. I'm very confident that that will happen. I would like people to obviously respond to the consultation. Obviously, people are able to respond against it and for it. That's why it's a consultation. Okay, it may not be what everyone's desire is to have this particular legislation passed, and I can't guarantee it will happen either. But that is the will of the Liberal Democrats, certainly, and I'm very proud to say that I was the one who wrote and the author of the motion for Liberal Democrat Conference, which started this whole debate. And I'm pleased that we're having this debate, even though it may be on a controversial subject which some people don't like debating. But it's better to debate it than not debate it at all. And I hope everyone's enjoyed themselves this evening. Thank you very much.